thank you very much. I want to thank the Farm Foundation and all of you for reawakening my SPS geek, which had been lying dormant for decades. As Dan mentioned, in 2016, I was the Republican candidate for governor, so I really haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about SPS lately. But it absorbed my life in the 1980s and in the 1990s. In the 1980s, I was working with the apple, pear, and cherry industry on the West Coast, and my job was to eliminate unfair trade barriers around the world confronting our fruit exports. And in the 1980s, for the most part, that was quarantine barriers and phytosanitary disputes. And I tried, sometimes with limited success, often with just a lot of frustration, to eliminate some of those barriers using the TBT, or the trade barrier, what was it called? Technical trade barriers. Technically, for trade barriers to trade in the Tokyo round, but it was definitely an imperfect instrument for dealing with the types of barriers that we were confronting in the 1980s and the 1990s in the tree fruit industry. So when we started talking about a new round of multilateral negotiations, I was right there saying, hey, we have got to come up with new standards for sanitary and phytosanitary standards around the world. And worked very closely with, you probably remember Jim Grueff. Ken Roberts was here earlier with Ken, with Gretchen over at the Secretariat, and really put together, I think, an agreement, not just us, but a lot of other people, put together an agreement which has stood the test of time and has actually provided a great deal of benefits and is relevant today. And so what I would like to do, and what I've been asked to do, is to provide you kind of with a real overview primer of the agreement, since not everybody wakes up thinking about Article 5. And so if I start talking about Article 5, or the subsequent speakers talk about Article 5, you'll know what I'm talking about. I can tell you a few weeks ago, when my SPS geek was still dormant, before I got the call and asked me to come talk to you, I couldn't have recited Article 5, although at one point I probably could have read the whole agreement to you by heart. But I want to kind of lay out what the agreement is, what it isn't. That's the boring part, or the most straightforward part. But then talk about 2 or 3 of the very early cases which define the member obligations and continue to define the member obligations today, and talk about how those cases and these provisions really are relevant to some of the challenges that lie ahead. So if we talk about the agreement, I don't even know what Article 1 is, but Article 2 is really very important, and it's really the mission statement or the vision statement for the entire agreement. And it wraps it all up in a few very nice sentences. Essentially what it says is, if you can maintain whatever sanitary or phytosanitary standard you want to preserve the health and plant health of your people and your environment, but you must base those standards on sufficient scientific evidence. And that there has got to be a rational relationship between the science and the standard. That the standard must emerge from the science. You can't figure out where you want to end up at the end of the day, and then go back and cherry pick the science to justify the standard you've already decided you want. That there must be sufficient scientific evidence, and that the standard you choose must emerge from that science. Article 3 is aspirational as well. And what it really wanted member states to do is to begin to move to harmonize sanitary and phytosanitary standards around the world. So it encouraged the members to defer whenever possible, if it achieved their level of protection, their desired level of protection, to defer to international standards. And the international standards that it cites specifically are what we refer to as the 3 sisters. That's Codex, largely for your food standards, OIE for vet and animal standards, and then the IPPC, the International Plant Protection Convention, for plant health. And that if you did defer to those standards, then you pretty much were considered to be in compliance with your subsequent obligations, because those standards have been based on a legitimate risk assessment. Article 4 encourages member states to acknowledge equivalency. And that is that you have a product coming into your country, it might not be produced exactly as you would have it produced in your country, but as long as it meets the level of protection that you have established, even if it got there in a different way, you need to recognize that production practice as equivalent. The focus then is really on whether or not the product coming across your border meets an appropriate pre-established level of protection that you find acceptable. Article 5. Article 5 really is the heart of the SPS agreement. And without Article 5, there is no agreement, in my opinion. And if we ever have decisions which undermine Article 5, I think it's not an exaggeration to say it would go so far as to undermine the integrity of the agreement itself. Article 5 says that, again, you can set whatever standard you want, but it must be based on a risk assessment. The members have an obligation to conduct a risk assessment when setting a sanitary or phytosanitary standard, and that risk assessment must be evidence-based, and that the assessment must emerge from that scientific evidence. And that then you can set whatever standard of risk you find acceptable, but then you must apply that level of risk across all similar circumstances. So you can't accept no risk in certain cases and high risk in other similar situations. You must apply a similar level of risk across all similar situations. Article 6 acknowledges regional differences. This is particularly important for plant health because before this agreement, if you had a disease in your country, let's say there was some bug in South Carolina, then they could prohibit apple exports from Washington State, even though that critter would die every winter in Washington State. If it existed in the United States, you're not going to export apples from the United States. Article 6 requires countries to recognize regional differences in pest-free zones. And 7, really pretty straightforward, is it requires a threshold and standards for transparency and ensures that regulations will be available at inquiry points through the WTO to any member who wants them. It's really a very simple agreement. There's a lot of footnotes and there are annexes, but that is essentially the members' rights and obligations. How's it worked out? Well, what I and a few others thought were pretty straightforward and a beautiful few sentences suddenly became subject to a lot of differences of what really member states had and hadn't agreed to, and that came to the forefront immediately with, wait for it, the beef hormone case. Now, remember, the beef hormone case had been prosecuted since the 1980s under the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade with not a lot of success. So why not take this very politicized issue and use it to try out this new agreement? And that's exactly what we did, although it was very politicized before it ever found its way to the WTO. As you all remember, the European Union was and is banning the use of certain hormones, artificial hormones in beef. As a result, it was restricting the imports of beef from the United States. The United States did not think that that was a science-based standard. And so in some cases, this was a good test case for the new SPS agreement. The United States argued that there were international standards set by international standard-setting bodies on these hormones. And therefore, the European Union had an obligation under Article 3 to defer to those international standards. The United States also argued that there was no evidence to support the European standard, that it was a political decision, not a science-based decision, and that they had not gone through a scientific evidence-based risk assessment, and therefore they were in violation of Article 5. And that they treated different hormones differently. And so they accepted a high level or some risk for some hormones, but then had a very low or zero level of risk for these hormones that were used in the United States. And therefore they were inconsistently applying the level of risk, again, in violation of Article 5. The Europeans didn't really see it that way. They read Article 3 differently. They really didn't think they had the obligations to defer to international standards that the United States and other members thought that they did. They introduced this whole idea that standards needed, no, it isn't a new idea, it's something we all deal with, but that the standards need to be based on risk management, not just a risk assessment. Now, Article 5 is very clear, in my opinion, and it says that the standard must be based on, and as only international trade lawyers can do, there's a whole section in these panel reports on what based on means, but that it needs to be based on the risk assessment. But they said that the risk assessment can, pull together this evidence, but at the end of the day, there are risk management decisions that need to be taken into account. And they argued that when making these risk management decisions, that they would exercise the precautionary principle. They would exercise an abundance of caution, and that even a minute risk was not acceptable. So it really was, in many cases, or in many ways, a good test case for whether or not Article 5 and this whole SPS agreement was going to have the teeth that many of us had hoped it would have. The first issue the panel took up was Article 3. Do they have an obligation to defer to international standards? There are international standards, I think, on 4 out of the 5 or 5 out of the 6 hormones that were in dispute. Shouldn't the European Union just defer to the international standard that had been set? The panel rules, which I think is very consistent with the language in the agreement itself, any member state can set whatever standard it wants. It does not have to automatically defer to international standards. But if it doesn't defer to international standards, it needs to have a risk assessment which brings it to a different conclusion. And that risk assessment must, in a sense, justify why it needs to have a higher level of protection than afforded it by the international standard. And then it needs to apply that level of risk across the board. So it said, whether it's consistent with Article 3 or not, whether it should defer to international standards, really depends on whether or not the European Union conducted this risk assessment. So they jump to the heart, to Article 5. And here they argue that there's got to be a probable risk, and that the European Union failed to identify a probable risk associated with these beef hormones. The European Union was arguing that it was out of abundance of caution. The panel said that's a hypothetical risk, and that you have to have an identifiable risk, because you have to assess the risk, right? And if you can't identify the risk, how then can you go on to assess it? So it said there has to be an identifiable risk associated, and that was not presented by the Europeans, nor did they present any evidence supporting their standard, nor did they have an assessment. And importantly, and this goes back to Article 2, you can't figure out where you want to end up and then do your assessment. Your standard has to emerge from the assessment. And to the extent that there had been any assessment at all, it was the Europeans going backwards and cherry-picking the data to try and justify where they ended up. And the panel ruled that they had unevenly applied a level of risk, accepting less risk on these hormones used by the United States than other hormones. So, no risk assessment, uneven application. They're in violation of Article 5, which means they're in a violation of Article 3. We won. But the Europeans didn't quite see it that way. And so, as you can imagine, they appealed, and the appellate body largely supported the panel, which is a victory for the SPS agreement. In my opinion, though, they unfortunately introduced a bit of ambiguity in their discussion, and that's ambiguity that the Europeans just latch onto. They minimized the panel's discussion, or where the panel talked about you have to have a probable risk, and said that they didn't find the probable language in the agreement, that you have to have a potential risk, which they said is essentially possible risk. So that begins to kind of, in that particular body, I think, muddy what level of risk do you need to quantify. And there again, they say it might not even need to be quantified, it could be qualified. But clearly, it needs to be identified, and it needs to be described. So the fact that there was no identifiable risk, the appellate body fortunately kind of dumps all over the precautionary principle, because there is no real risk, there's a hypothetical risk, and that's not acceptable. So that's a victory. But unfortunately, because of discussions over possible versus probable, and pest management versus pest risk assessment, there's an ambiguity that I think is clear enough, but some of my European counterparts might seize onto and watch. They will when we talk about hazard. A case that was going on at exactly the same time, or about the same time as the appellate body, was Canada versus Australia on salmon. Australia was not letting in Canadian salmon because of some potential risks, regarding quarantine risks. Here, the panel is very clear, and they really shut down this conversation about potential versus probable. And they say, if you're going to maintain a standard, you better have a probable risk. and that you better be prepared to quantify it. And you have to identify the pathway on how that risk enters, establishes, and spreads in your country. In my opinion, SPS Geek, it's beautiful language. It's very clear. A likely pathway must be established. And if the exporting country can come up with an alternative way of meeting your standard, and that standard is less trade restrictive, and it's easily applicable, and it meets your level of protection, then the importing country must accept it. That played very well into the next case that we brought, which was Japan. The Washington Northwest U.S. apple industry was not allowed to ship to Japan because of a disease that existed here, not in Japan, but apples were not a vector of the disease. And the Japanese could not identify how apples presented a probable risk. That salmon and that apple case, I think, clarify a lot of the ambiguity that might exist in the European hormone case. That's relevant today because, as has been mentioned earlier, and as some of the panelists will talk about, with this whole hazard approach that the European Union is using to take hundreds of chemicals potentially off the market because of a theoretical or hypothetical hazard, could put us in a position today of relitigating a lot of the language that we argued in the hormone case. So while this is an agreement that is decades old and has laid dormant, in me at least, for about a decade, it is very relevant today. And as we move into a situation where food safety is increasingly important to countries all across the world, and their consumers are demanding that they take action, it's going to be very critical for us to ensure that that action taken is consistent with the SPS agreement. Thank you.